Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network. I'm your host, Sher Ali Khan. In this conversation, we speak with Federico Fuentes, editor of Bolivia Rising, a board member at VenezuelaAnalysis.com, and a former Caracas-based contributor to Australia's Green Left Weekly. He's also a co-author of Latin America's Turbulent Transitions, The Future of First-Century Socialism, and has co-authored 3 books with Marta Harnecker on the New Left in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Paraguay. Today we talk about Venezuela after the U.S. assault and the seizure of Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores, and what transition means when it is being imposed through power rather than decided through popular sovereignty. We also place this back inside the longer arc of the pink tide and 21st century socialism, what it built, what it depended on, and what is being dismantled. Like, share, and subscribe. If you find this conversation meaningful, and if you'd like to support the work, visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Welcome to the show, Federico. How are you doing?
Very good, thank you. I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak about what I believe is an extremely important issue for left and progressive people all around the world. Just to make one small clarification, I'm no longer on the board of the editorial board of Venezuela Analysis, but obviously, continues to be a good source of news on what's happening in Venezuela that I follow along. But just to make that short point at the start. But yeah, as I said, really grateful to be able to talk about issues that unfortunately don't get probably talked enough about, in a serious way on the left.
Excellent. In plain terms, what changed between the 2024 election and January 3rd that made Venezuela vulnerable to being handled this way, militarily, politically, and symbolically?
Well, I think in some ways, not much changed in Venezuela. The biggest change really between the 2024 presidential elections in Venezuela and the January 3 military assault on the capital and the kidnapping of President Nicolas Maduro and Cilia Flores, often just referred to as his wife, but in her own right, an important politician, having been previously, for example, the former head of the National Assembly. The biggest real change that I think helps us to try to better comprehend exactly what happened and what is happening in Venezuela today was the election of President Trump. Because the election of President Trump represented both beginning of an overall shift in US foreign policy and then a change or a market shift in the US foreign policy specific to Venezuela. And when Trump first came into power, I had a number of people ask me about, what would this mean for Venezuela? And just assuming that this would just mean a continuation of US foreign policy. And I said, look, that was an option, but another quite as likely option would be some kind of rapprochement with the Maduro government. And this was something that had already been hinted at by Trump and some of the people close to him, and became apparent that this was certainly one line of thinking within the Trump administration when he selected Richard Grenell as his special envoy to Venezuela, who a few months later would do, what was an unprecedented move by a US government, which was to send a high-ranking official to meet directly with Maduro in the presidential palace in Caracas. But that wasn't the only signal, other signals that you could see that there was some kind of shift in the policy was the fact that the outgoing Biden administration had made a big point of pointing out that they didn't believe the results of the 2024 presidential elections in Venezuela, that they had believed that they were going to give the official designation of president-elect to Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition candidate in those elections, and that they would move to also to designate him as essentially the president, even if he wasn't operating as a president, that the US would officially recognize him as a president of Venezuela. But Trump didn't really pay much attention to that, didn't invite him to his inauguration, never met with him, still hasn't met with him. So that was an indication that there was some shifts aboard. So how do we get then to January 3? I think we see, what I didn't expect, which was the two different, somewhat contradictory aspects of US foreign policy coming together to give us the outcome we have. So on the one hand, the US government was keen to continue to push to see how it could change the nature of the government in Caracas. It had previously sought to do that through sanctions, and it has succeeded in part in terms of shifting the political project that the government represented in Venezuela, away from the kind of progressive vision of 21st century socialism that Maduro's predecessor Hugo Chavez had done, had sort of carried out or become a renowned for, towards a much more sort of pro-capital, anti-worker sort of policy implemented by the Nicolas Maduro government. But it hadn't gotten rid of the Nicolas Maduro government, and in fact, the Nicolas Maduro government had demonstrated that it was able to ride out, at the very minimum were highly disputed election results in 2024. To this day, the results haven't been published. I think one has to be probably perhaps a bit naive to think that there wasn't at least some level of fraud in those elections. I've never heard of an election where the winner refuses to publish the evidence that demonstrates that they won an election. Yet this is what we have in the 2024 presidential election. But Maduro showed the US that his government was not going away, that even in the face of this popular opposition, that it was able to maintain stability in the country. So Trump steps up the military deployment in the region, doesn't necessarily step up the sanctions, in fact, re-invites or allows Chevron to continue to operate in the region, but at some point decides that what is necessary for the US administration's behalf is to send a clear message to those in Caracas. They will have to subordinate themselves to Washington if they are wanting to remain in power. So the Trump administration accepts that they can't just go in and start a war, a land invasion. That would be too costly. It would be costly politically. Obviously, Trump presents himself as putting an end to the forever wars. It would be costly in terms of loss of lives, but he needs some kind of shift. And so that's how we get to the January 3, assault on Caracas and the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro, where on the one hand, it's, on the surface, all that's been achieved is the removal of the president. The government itself is still in power in Caracas, the same government. But there has been a fundamental change that's occurred as a result of this military action. And we see that in the fact that almost within a fortnight, the new government in Caracas is on some of the most best terms we've seen of any government in the world today with the Trump administration, with each of them sharing on social media messages about how terrific they all are and how they're working together on mutual basis of mutual respect to move forward with the diplomatic relations. So I think that's what changes. That's the biggest change is the Trump administration. It's an administration that understood that internally within Venezuela, the opposition that the US governments had backed for so long just did not have, in particular, the military power, but in a more broader sense, the social base to be able to maintain government and stability within the country. So Trump recognizes that he has to deal with the Maduro administration in some form, but decides that the best way to deal with them is to completely subordinate them, to send them the clearest possible message that if they want to remain in power, they need to do what he requires of them. And he does that very, very brazenly by the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores.
There's also been a recent newspaper hit piece that frames your time in Caracas, your work with Marta Harnecker and the Centro Internacional Miranda, as if it were clandestine ideological engineering. How do you respond to the attempt to turn your Caracas work into a sort of scat?
Yeah, look, this is classic, sort of right-wing corporate media sort of baiting of the left attempts to find any sort of tenuous link to then somehow portray the idea that a government overseas is somehow the only reason why left-wing groups exist in the country somewhere else. So the journalist, the piece you're particularly referring to is a journalist who writes for the Daily Telegraph, whose last 5 articles, were largely about Chinese influence in Australian universities, about Russian influence in Australian universities. So it's all a big part of that Red Scare. But that said, it does raise an important issue. And that is the question of, how then does the left deal with these kind of governments? A government which certainly, in my opinion, the Chavez government was one that there was much that could be supported of that government. Of course, no government is perfect. No one is perfect. I myself as an individual have made mistakes. So that, the idea of trying to find a perfect place, that's just fantasy. But what we can look at is the overall trajectory of what's occurring in a country, of how government is operating, and make a firm decision on that regards. But what we've had in Venezuela it has been, I think, a very complex Well, in some ways very complex, but in other ways quite simple situation. And that is, it's complicated because for too long, much of the left preferred to, and I include myself in this category to be honest, to focus simply on the discourse, focus simply on what was being said, focus simply on claims, whether that be from the government or government supporters, as opposed to the actual politics, the actual policies, the actual data, the actual evidence coming out of those countries. If one looks at Venezuela, one easily begins to think we're dealing with a left-wing government and regularly holds international meetings to talk about socialism, regularly waves red flags at their rallies, all these kind of things. But the actual reality inside Venezuela is an extremely different one. Firstly, starting with the discourse of the government. I mean, it has one discourse for an international audience, another discourse for inside the country, where it's far less likely to find it talking about socialism, much more likely to talk about individual entrepreneurship, and the kind of discourse much more popular amongst neoliberal circles than it is amongst left-wing circles. But also the reality of the data, indicated that there was, tremendous stripping of wealth of workers in that government under the Maduro government, which of course in part are due to the US sanctions, but cannot solely be explained by that. There was a tremendous stripping away of democratic rights for workers' organizations, for left organizations. And so at that point, we have to make a decision. Do we focus on the discourse or should we focus on the actions? Well, in our country, we generally focus on the actions of political parties and governments to determine how we interact with them. I think the same approach should be taken to Venezuela. And if we take that honest approach, then we have to say that really the Maduro government a long time ago stopped really being a left and progressive government. And that's a challenge, but that unfortunately is a challenge, going back to your question about the hit piece of having to deal with that reality, that because of its discourse, it's caused widespread confusion, not just amongst the left, but amongst many people around the world who, for one reason or another, continue to view somehow Maduro as being associated with the socialist project.
Michael Lebowitz once wrote that it was only after the defeat of the April 2002 coup and the December 2002 to January 2003 bosses lockout that the slaveholders' revolt had put the sword in the hands of the masses. The government had not formally changed, but the balance of forces had. What was the content of that shift, and why did it allow the process to go on the offensive?
Yeah. So again, this actually is a good way of bringing what we were talking about with the first and the second question together. That how a government seemingly on the surface can actually change in its nature, even though the same individuals stay there, and how determining how a government operates and functions can't simply be decided by its discourse, but actually by the social base that it rests on. So Chavez is elected in 1998. And of course, from very early on, he has a very progressive discourse. And there's no denying that. And his main discourse at that time, although it will still be many years until he would be talking about anti-imperialism and 21st century socialism, but it was very much a progressive democratic discourse that focused or had at its heart, at its center, the question of popular protagonism, of people's involvement in dealing with their sort of overcoming the sort of issues that they faced, and really the need to center human development as a way to change society. So in real simple terms, one of the slogans that Chavez would say is, to explain his policy, was that in order to get rid of poverty, you had to give power to the people. And that's what he sought to do. He sought to do that by changing the constitution, by enacting a number of decrees to do with land reform, with oil, and sought to sort of solidify links between the military and the poor by carrying out certain sort of projects where the military would go and work side by side with the communities, particularly after a very devastating mudslide in the first few years of his term. But the reality was that despite his discourse and intent, it was really the opposition at that point that had the political initiative. It had that in large part on the streets. The streets were contested, but the opposition was certainly at that time able to mobilize very large demonstrations, in some ways much larger than it has been in more recent years. It also, as was exposed through the April 2002 coup, continue to have weight in the military, and hence why you have, much of the military high command that participates in that April 2002 coup. And it continued to have control of the oil industry, in particular the state oil company PDVSA. and was able to use that to basically stop the flow of funds from the state oil company going through into the coffers of the state, into the national budget to be used for programs to eradicate poverty. The 2002 coup, defeat of the coup attempt, which sees a mass mobilization. And, it's interesting to compare it, the huge scale of the demonstrations that take place in April 2002 in comparison to the demonstrations we've seen more recently to the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. Back then we're talking hundreds of thousands, if not into the millions of people that in some way or another mobilized around the country. Today we're talking, tens of thousands, if we want to be extremely generous, 100,000 at some of the biggest rallies. The scale is just incomparable. So you have that social base that comes out onto the streets, that wins the confidence that it itself can regain and reimpose its president in power. We have the split in the military that enables Chavez to get rid of a whole bunch of high-ranking generals who are operating against the government in order to sort of depurify the military and at the very minimum have a military that would now stick to the constitutional order. I think it'd be exaggeration to say all of a sudden we had a revolutionary Red Army, but at least it was now an army that understood, firstly, that the majority of people, those who had voted for Chavez, would defend that government, and that any further attempt to try to overthrow it would require a very serious bloodbath. And so was willing to stick to the constitution. And then the oil lockout allowed it to get control of the oil industry and importantly, the revenue flow from that. So you have what is essentially the same government at the start of 2002 is a very different government by the end of the oil strike, even though the personnel is the same. The difference is it now rests on a social power that's able to then explain the kind of political projects that happen over the next period of time that really fuel and make possible what up until then had largely just been ideas of the Chavez government.
Your provocation is that 2024 plus January 3rd inverted that relationship, that the sword had been put in Trump's hand. If we take that seriously, what does that mean in practice? Who can set the terms? Who can punish? Who can force outcomes? Who can ignore Venezuelan consent?
So the first thing I would say to answer that question is that I think we need to understand that between 2002, 2003 and the 2024 elections and what we saw on January 3 is that there's also a period, this one is a bit more difficult to define in terms of specific events and dates, but I think it sort of roughly goes from about 2015, 2016 to about 2018, so a period of a few years, where taking Michael Leibowitz's sort of phrasing, he talks about the sword passing over into the hands of the slave revolt of the masses. Well, I think there's a period that basically from about 2015 to about 2018, that sword passes from the masses to the state, and more specifically to the governing party apparatus and the military. So there's already a rupture. That is that it no longer is it really the popular base that is the sort of directing the movement, that instead power now resides directly within those elites in the state. And in fact, they will use that power against the masses themselves. So it's during that period that we see the beginnings of prior to that. Yeah, and this is why I think it is important. I don't think we can just sort of simply say, I don't think it's correct to sort of use the idea that somehow Chavez was good, everything that happened with Chavez was good, everything that happened with Maduro from day one was bad, or that it's just a personality issues. So that's why I don't say it starts at 2013 when Maduro gets elected, because there's a period where there's a contestation. The vacuum left by Chavez opens up a big discussion and debate. People within the government are trying to think, how do we move forward? Some people are putting forward radical proposals. Others are putting proposals to maintain the current status quo. Others are saying, look, we basically, this is a period of retreat and we need to move back towards, trying to seek alliances with capital. Now, a whole series of factors in those years, starting with the loss of the elections in the National Assembly. So that's the first real warning bell that actually, we can't just take popular support for granted. Added to that, there's stepping up of US subversion and right-wing opposition violence within the country, and the internal debates that are, decided not in the favor of the more left-wing forces, means that we see a period where the government quite consciously works to basically disempower the masses and ensure that power resides within the state and the military. That then only exacerbated the problem.
Yeah, I think in your commentary, you've said that a major issue has been how the left and other forces are fixed on appearances rather than what battles change for the workers and the poor. What is the same mistake now, and what are the concrete signs on the ground that Venezuela is losing its ability to decide its own future?
Yeah, I'll answer that question and just quickly finish the other one. And because they're both again related, because people stuck with focusing on the surface and the discourse, they think nothing changes in that period. But if you can't understand that change, then you can't understand why we get to the 2024 presidential elections, where Maduro is, as I said before, it's quite clear that in elections where you're not willing to submit any verifiable evidence to prove that you won, probably is on the balance, should be, most people will see that as being evidence that you didn't win those elections. So that hollows out the social, any kind of real base within the country of the government. I think, and the US government realizes that, and Trump administration that comes in realizes that they're now dealing with, this is a government that, yes, can maintain power. It is certainly consolidated power in terms of its hold on the military and the state apparatus, but doesn't have the popular support that it once did. And then can then use the January 3 attempt to basically, finishing off the passing of the sword, pass it into the hands of the Trump administration. But what does that lead us to today? Well, today there's no doubt, if we look at the events that are occurring, that there's an extremely rapid loss of not just popular sovereignty in the sense of people's sovereignty over the state and the government and its ability to keep the governments to account, but just basic national sovereignty. Dealing with a situation where is now the US openly not just saying but doing, using Venezuelan oil, selling it in the international market, getting the proceeds of that, putting it into accounts in Qatari banks, and deciding how that money will be spent. The Venezuelan government, the only involvement they have in all of this at the moment is to basically coordinate with the US government to help seize oil tankers that are carrying Venezuelan oil that has been deemed to be, sanctioned or illegal oil by the US. I mean, this is unheard of. And if it was happening in any other country, the left would absolutely be out in arms saying, look, this is imperialist sort of, piracy, theft, wealth being ripped. But there's a section that is still stuck with the idea, well, no, nothing's changed in Caracas. It's still the Maduro government, minus Maduro, obviously, as president that's in power. This government is still the government that goes back to Chavez. Therefore, it's still a progressive, socialist, and imperialist government. So we can't really sort of discuss this absolute loss of basic sovereignty that's occurring in Venezuela or raise the issue. Now, here, my point that I make here is not, it's not about criticizing the government in Venezuela. I mean, one has to accept that, they're in a position where almost they have no other option. I mean, I think it wouldn't be unfair to say that. It's not like we can then debate, is this an option that perhaps they would have accepted, minus obviously all the kidnapping and the blackmail and all this that's occurring right now and the serious threats of violence. I think for a long time the Maduro government has been seeking an accommodation with the US government, but I don't think it certainly wasn't seeking it on these terms, which are totally disfavorable to it. And I think this is part of Trump's plan, is to make it very clear to everyone, particularly in Latin America, but the world, that once you dare to sort of disagree, this is how you will be treated. So there's that aspect of what's occurring. So it's very difficult for them, but there's not even the pretense of the government explaining it in that. Instead, we get, as I said, the very public statements by the Venezuelan government that the relationship has never been better with the US. The somewhat absurd argument that the re-establishment of embassies in Caracas and in Washington needs to be done on the basis of being able to maintain the diplomatic campaign to free Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores, as if somehow without these embassies that haven't been operating now for quite a long time, they would not be able to continue that campaign. All of this is a discourse that very much shows that the government, at least for now, is not showing any indications that it wants to put up a serious fight against this absolute loss of sovereignty. Now, I certainly hope that it does, because the unfortunate reality is that after many years of depoliticization, of fragmentation of the left, of economic sort of crisis, of mass migration, of disintegration of essentially the social fabric in Venezuela, the left is not far from being strong enough to be able to wage the kind of necessary battle that's required to fight off this attack on sovereignty. And it needs to be able to form a united front, if not with the government, at least with sections of the government. The government as a whole is not willing to lead this fight to defend, as I said, the most basic elements of sovereignty. But that's my hope that is what happens. But unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment is, on the one hand, no indication whatsoever that the government even acknowledges that that's the reality that they face, let alone wanting to or saying that they're in a position to be able to fight it. And then secondly, I left it is in partial confusion about what's actually happening today in Venezuela, where they still believe that really nothing has fundamentally changed, when the change is, extremely dramatic and open for everyone to see.
Right now, the debate keeps collapsing into this idea that either Trump sidelined the opposition or Delcy Rodriguez betrayed Maduro. What did these sort of forms of analysis miss about the deeper continuity of power that's being consolidated through this transition?
Yeah, so look, in terms of the opposition, as I said at the start, I don't think this is a new factor that Trump has sidelined the opposition. I think very early on in his administration, and perhaps even dating back to the end of his first administration, it became clear that he basically no longer really believed the opposition story that were in the ability to actually take power in Venezuela. You've got to remember, during the first Trump administration, Trump had been sold the story that they were going to install Juan Guaido then as the head of the National Assembly, as the president of Venezuela, the interim president of Venezuela. The US directed a lot of funds towards his campaign, his sort of attempt to install a parallel government in Venezuela. Yeah, it was never anything more than a sort of imaginary government in Venezuela. Internationally, of course, it was used to isolate Venezuela and the Maduro government, but within Venezuela, it was never had any power whatsoever. And so I think the Trump administration catches on to that. And so that's why, like, for instance, as well, during when Maria Corina Machado, sort of probably the key figure of the right-wing opposition, was granted the Nobel Peace Prize. At the time, many were sort of saying, well, this is just part of Trump's sort of war drum for Venezuela. And I said, actually, it's much more likely that this is being pushed by a section of the liberal establishment, who, of course, are willing to go along with Trump's idea of regime change in Venezuela. But for them, they want that regime change to involve some kind of democratic transition and a handover of power to Maria Corina Machado. But Trump is not interested in that. Trump's not interested in democracy in Venezuela. In fact, never once really during this whole last 6 months of military buildup and leading up to January 6th has he mentioned democracy. He's mentioned narco trafficking, he's mentioned terrorism, he's mentioned oil, but whenever he's asked about democracy, he says, well, look, let's hope that at some later day that may be able to happen. But right now we've got much more important things to worry about. And he's been quite honest in that regards, that the intervention was never about democracy, and by that it also meant that it was never really about imposing the right wing government, the right wing opposition in power. If they could get away with what they wanted to do by maintaining the current government in power. And that seems to be what at least they're wagering on now. Of course, we'll have to see how that happens. Now, regarding the other question, this sort of the idea that somehow there's been some kind of betrayal within the government, obviously this falls into the realm of speculation of which we have no evidence for. But I think these kind of speculations largely serve two purposes. The first is that it serves a purpose of always trying to find anything but the weaknesses and problems of the Maduro government to kind of explain the situation they're in. So, the fact that the US could so easily basically walk into Caracas and still kidnap the president and walk out with, I think the report was that maybe there was one US armed forces figure that got a shot in the leg, maybe. That was it. It seems somewhat remarkable. So, of course, there's a tendency to then want to come up with some explanation that, this must have been an inside job or whatever, when sometimes the most obvious answer is the correct one. In this case, that it was largely incompetence. It's largely that the Venezuelan government, despite 6 months of this military buildup, both showed that its armed forces, while very good for internal repression, were not really at all built to deal with this scenario. And I think also demonstrate that there was probably a large important section of the government that thought they could just call Trump's bluff. I think they honestly thought that such an action wouldn't happen. So I think the one side of those sort of that this was betrayal of Maduro seeks to try to just hide the basic mistakes and weaknesses of the government. I think it also tries to draw some kind of discontinuity between the outlook of the Maduro government and of now the Delcy Rodriguez government, whereas I see a lot more continuity. Of course, it's in a different context. As I said before, it's in a context where the Trump administration essentially now has a gun to Rodriguez's head to force them to do this, what they're doing now. But there's been indications for several years now that the Maduro government was more than happy to come to some kind of rapprochement with the US government, that even during the military buildup that it had made several offers to the Trump administration to sign lucrative oil deals and deals for natural resources, rare earth minerals, that the US government wanted moving forward. But I think fitting Venezuela into the broader context of Trump's new national security strategy and his vision for foreign policy, a red line for Trump was that Maduro had to go, that the message had to be sent, that, it would seem for the Trump administration upon a weakness that it says it wants full spectrum dominance of the region, but allows a figure that's associated with politics that supposedly opposed to him to stay in power. And that's ultimately why we see the operation carried out on January 3 to remove Maduro from power. But while we also see such a rapid and, even for me, remarkably quick sort of transition in terms of the relationship between the two governments, which are governments that have been forged on I struggle to even say neo-colonial sort of basis. I feel like more like colonial ties is much more something we're approaching when we look at the relationships between Washington and Caracas today.
If we place this back inside the pink tide, what did the pink tide actually contain in terms of different projects, different class coalitions, different relationships to oil, gas, and mining? And what is flattened when it's treated as one unified left term?
Yeah, I think a lot, and that I suppose shows the weakness of a term which was really more a sort of a journalistic sort of term than a very serious political term. Pink tide, is much more used in the sort of media to sort of portray, a very eclectic bunch of everything from radical left, maybe if you even want to go as far as to say socialist governments, such as the Chavez government, through to governments like the Michelle Bachelet government in Chile, which wasn't not only was it just a centre left at best or centrist government, but it was also a government of a traditional party in Chile. Like at least most of the other left parties that rise to power during this period of time, which is essentially from Chavez's election in 1998 through to sometime in the mid 2000s, where we start to see sort of a change towards the right, a shift towards the right in electoral victories. But most of the parties that come to power, whether it's Rafael Correa's Citizens Revolution in Ecuador, Evo Morales' movement towards socialism in Bolivia. The PT is a kind of in between because it's not a brand new left party, but it is a party forged out of the military dictatorship. So it's not that old. It arises in the 80s, and it's only for the first time that it comes into power under Lula da Silva. So like I said, it's quite eclectic. So it really that's why the pink to sort of indicate that we're not talking about a overall radical shift, but just a generalized sort of move towards the left, and tied to indicate that it's happening across the continent. But I think it did confuse a lot of issues. So for example, it confused the question of government and governmental power. So as we'll talk about earlier today, even the Chavez government itself, when the personnel stayed the same, changes from before 2002 to early 2003. But in most of the other countries, nothing of that similar sort happens. So instead, really what you have is left parties being elected in capitalist elections to administer capitalist governments and capitalist states, ever really achieve the kind of social base that enables them to carry out the kind of radical forms that are required. In fact, quite often, many of these governments are elected as a last gasp of popular struggle. And a good example of that is the PT, Workers' Party in Brazil, where actually most of the struggle predates its election. And it's only sort of kind of on the decline of the social movements that the PT finally achieves the electoral victory that it fought so hard for something like like 20 years. So all of that gets flattened. All of that sort of gets mistaken with the idea that really the only thing that's important is the question of election of left parties into government. But it doesn't take any consideration, A, who are these left parties? What are their actual political projects beyond just a vague identification with the left? And as I've said, that varies from everything from Chavez's program that would later become 21st century socialism through the traditional Socialist Party in Chile, who had been in government many times before, and had never done any radical reforms during its time in government. But it just sort of compresses all those into just one amorphous left label of left governments. But it also ignores the question of the importance of social mobilization in order to convert what at that point just sort of left or centrist, but left centrist left parties administering capitalist governments into actual governments that are not just representing, but actually backed by and fully mobilized backed by the full mobilization of the popular classes. And I think that we can really only talk about occurring in Venezuela and to a certain extent in Bolivia as well. Where we do see the election of the Evo Morales government lead to some very intense confrontations that happen afterwards, but this doesn't really happen elsewhere. So, I think these are just some of the problems with that term, although, as I said, it served a journalistic purpose, and I could see why people use it. I don't have a problem with using that term, but I don't think it should be understood as as a scientific term, as a political term, because it misses much more than what it really gathers. And I think, unfortunately, has perhaps created certain confusions on the left looking, for them trying to understand Latin America today.
Across the pink tide, there was this developmentalist sort of emergence, which was like neo-developmentalism, which used the commodity boom to fund redistribution, expand the state, build a new social base, while staying tied to world markets. In Venezuela, what did that make possible, and where did it become a trap?
Yeah, so I mean, this has obviously always been like a complex aspect to the Venezuelan sort of project because it's a country so tied to oil, and it leads to various different readings. So I think there's a couple of things that are important to break down. First thing, the simple response is often, well, what Venezuela did was only possible because of high commodity prices and in particular oil prices. Well, we have to remember that when Chavez was elected in 1998, oil prices don't really start to take off until somewhere in the mid 2000s. So there was certainly a period of time very early on in Chavez's government for a number of years where the barrel of oil we're talking $10, $15, nowhere near the $50 to $100 US dollars that it would later achieve. So it's not a case that from the start Chavez had this bonanza and was just able to use that. Secondly, when we discussed the question of the oil lockout in 2002, 2003, Chavez doesn't nationalize the oil industry because it's already in state hands. But that state oil company had always, as many state oil companies do around the world today, functioned for the benefit of transnational capital. I mean, no one honestly believes the Saudi, state oil company is some kind of model of socialism or social redistribution. The state has an important role to play in that, but it plays it basically as an adjunct to global capital that's flowing in and out of Saudi Arabia, and it's not working towards a peoples-based model in Saudi Arabia by any stretch of the imagination. So that important battle that happens in PDVSA is also required for Chavez to be able to make use of the oil revenue. And again, so that gets lost in the kind of idea that this is all because of high commodity prices. That said, it is still true that Venezuela had the problem, or still has the problem, of a highly oil-dependent economy, which creates all sorts of problems in terms of its ability to diversify its economy, its ability to have to deal with sanctions. Of course, when you are able to cut off just one particular industry, that has a huge impact on the government's ability to get revenue. But I think if I was to say, one thing is that I think that there's two important lessons that I believe are worthwhile, at least taking from the Chavez project, whilst at the same time understanding that obviously didn't come up with a formula to overcome the question of this is still a big challenge that the left faces, and particularly in those countries that are very natural resource rich. I think the first one is that Chavez did understood that even with oil at a very low price, that it was important to make rapid, important gains to people's living standards. Discourse and red flags wasn't enough. that day-to-day changes in people's living standards were crucial to maintain his popular support in those first years. And that's very much what he dedicated himself to. The second thing, though, was that he recognized that it wasn't enough to just do that, that ultimately, if the oil wealth was going to somehow feed a popular project, they needed to find mechanisms to be able to redistribute that, but not simply redistribute it through the state determining that money would go to particular healthcare, education, but also seeing how that could be used to help with the organizing of the. And Venezuela is a funny place, because if someone had have asked a leftist in the 90s, where would you imagine a radical left project to occur in South America? I don't think you would have found anyone who would pick Venezuela. That's not to say it hadn't had big spontaneous protests, as we saw, for instance, with the Caracazo in 1989. But it's not a country that had movements such as like the movement of landless workers, the MST in Brazil, didn't have the piqueteros, unemployed movement like Argentina did. It didn't have the indigenous movements like Bolivia and Ecuador did. All these other countries had movements that most leftists could probably name, and speak to you at length with. But if you asked them about Venezuela, they would be like, well, there's nothing happening there. So what the Chavez government was able to do was use that oil wealth to actually fund, not just fund programs, but make sure that those programs involve the creation of new institutions as what they hope would be the bedrock of new state structures, starting with the social missions, where it wasn't just about installing healthcare at the local level, but it was about involving local health workers and local community activists in determining what are the health issues in our local area, and very much in involving them in this process, through to the most important aspect, I would say, of Chavez's project, which was the communal councils and communes, where it was an attempt to involve local communities in really having a say, not just in terms of a say of what were the problems in the community, but having a say in diagnosing what is our community, what of all the myriad of problems that we face, what are the priority ones that we face, and how can we as a community resolve those issues? So it's really seeking to sort of empower the community, and then using that as a platform to then increasingly encroach on the power of elected officials. And that is part of where the whole communal council and communes project, was initiated with. That, of course, had its issues, had its problems. There's no denying that. And whenever you have a project that involves a redistribution of rents via the state into communities, there's always a tendency towards clientelism, the construction of these sort of top-down relations. But I think there were positive examples that show that it is something that's possible. The tensions will be there, but it's something that can be done. And I think was to me the most important part of how the Chavez government was sort of able to attempt to move beyond just a neo-developmentalist program, which tends to sort of just focus on sort of state control and state direction, but actually trying to move towards not just a people-oriented sort of project, but that a totally different type of state as well. One that unfortunately is not the one that we have today in Venezuela.
When 21st century socialism first emerged in Latin America, what were the problems that the older left was trying to answer about party politics, democracy, the state, and popular power? And how did it travel across the broader left movements in the region?
Yeah, so Chavez's call for 21st century socialism is interesting, because up until when Chavez starts to talk about socialism, or at least until he starts to talk about anti-imperialism, which was about a year or so before he talks about. So about 2004-5 is when he starts to talk about anti-imperialism. And then 2005-2006 is when he starts to talk about socialism. But up until then, the left had a kind of skeptical approach towards Chavez. They still tended to basically view him as someone who came from the military, so most likely just a kind of populist sort of, figure that, of which there had been plenty of in Latin American history. He wouldn't have been the first, sort of former military figure who had attempted a coup as a military rebellion, as Chavez did in 1992, who had then come to power. In fact, only around that same time, we had the experience in Ecuador of Lucio Gutierrez. Again, someone who comes from the military, was identified with the left, actually got elected with the support of the left, but not long after, basically sold out the left. So there remained quite a lot of skepticism towards Chavez and the project in Venezuela. But unfortunately, sometimes when the the focus is more on the discourse than the actions. It was the Chavez's discourse and the change in the discourse that sort of started to attract the attention of certain sections of the left. But his talk about a 21st century socialism also sort of cut across different lines, because he made it very clear that his first century socialism was in counterposition to 20th century socialism, essentially Stalinism. He made it very clear that the record of Stalinism was a negative record, that it was one that the left had to break from, that it was not seeking to build on the traditions of 20th century socialism and adapt them to the 21st century, but it represented a fundamental rupture from that socialism that had the state at its heart. That was its project. Its project was simply about state power. It was not about empowering people. It was not about thinking about how to develop a society where human development was at its heart. So, of course, different left, depending on how they related to 20th century socialist project, the Stalinist project, of course, then took varying positions towards the Chavez government. It's somewhat sad or ironic that many of those lessons from 20th century socialism weren't learnt, and today we see many of those errors having been committed over the last 10 years in Venezuela. I think beyond all that, one thing that I would say is that the Venezuelan government project has to be credited with at least re-raising the banner of socialism in the world today. Up until then, it really had become a dirty word and a word left on the sidelines. After that, even some parties not particularly associated with socialism, sort of started to kind of latch onto that. Of course, that's a double-edged sword with what's happening in Venezuela now, which is that, the left as a whole will have to reckon with the Venezuelan experience, both its positive aspects, but also its negative aspects. This is particularly the case for the Latin American left. I think sometimes the left outside of Latin America, you don't quite realize how much of how would I put, how's the best way to put it, how much Venezuela has come to be a really focal point of politics across the region, in the sense of a post, whilst many in the Western left may have Chavez and Maduro as their poster boys, up on their walls. It's actually the far right in Latin America that has Maduro as their poster boy, because for them it's the best example of this is what happens if you seek to go down the road of communism. And they've got about 7 million Venezuelans who have had to leave the country, through the mass migration that we've seen occur in that country, and pretty much arguably the largest non-war sort of mass migration we've seen. Most of them scattered throughout Latin America, South America, talking about the evils of the Maduro regime. Now, of course, again, I want to stress that I don't think everything that's happening in Venezuela can be solely put down to the government. You have to, of course, put this in the context of the sanctions. Of course, put this in the context of the actions of the right-wing opposition. But of course, put it in the context of what Trump is doing right now after January 3 in Venezuela. Or only by putting all of those pieces together can we really understand what's going on. But I don't think we can underestimate, just how strong Venezuela has become, the opposite of what it used to be. We used to certainly talk about it being the threat of the good example. In actual fact, today in Latin America in particular, it operates much more as the threat of the bad example of what happened. So these are part of the challenges that come about. But I still think that we can't but recognize the fact that really socialism, which had kind of disappeared off the political map for a whole bunch of different reasons following the fall of Stalinism, really sort of gets back onto the political map because of Venezuela and Chavez. And we should go back and look at that initial spirit of how he envisaged this 21st century socialism.
How should we understand sanctions as a tool that reshapes what is possible economically, legally, and politically without letting it erase internal choices and internal repression?
Yes. Look, to me that there's a couple of aspects that we need to consider when we're looking at the sanctions. The first is that, of course, we have to always have at the forefront, in terms of our public discourse, of course, so when we're talking about in our mainstream press or things like that, the sheer sort of horror of the impacts that sanctions can have on a country. They're not just illegal, but they're immoral and they're deadly. They have a deadly impact on the populations that are affected by them. This is, been proven time and time again, most recently an important study in Lancet Medical Journal talking about the numbers of deaths as a result of sanctions across the world over the last few decades. And there's been numerous studies, including by opposition Venezuelan sort of economists, that have shown exactly how dramatic the impacts of sanctions have been, not just in terms of the economic crisis in Venezuela, but as I said, in terms of the actual deaths in Venezuela, people who died because of malnutrition, people who died because they weren't able to access medication they would have otherwise been able to access. So that is one extremely important aspect of it. The second important aspect to the role that sanctions play, and again, why the left should oppose sanctions, irrespective of what they think of the government that the sanctions are being imposed in, is that they necessarily become the best tool for a government to use to justify any kind of internal repression and bad economic policies at home. And definitely saw that in Venezuela, where everything and anything was justified by the sanctions. And most importantly, by when we talk about workers' wages. I mean, this was consistently the government's position that, yes, we wanted to increase workers' wages. Venezuela's wages have been absolutely pulverized. I mean, the current minimum wage now in Venezuela is about 50 cents a month, not a week, but a month. It's non-existent. But the government's argument was that how can we even begin to deal with wages if we can't fix the economic situation because of the sanctions? Now, of course, when the sanctions were loosened under Biden in 2022, 2023, and the economy has been recovering since then, the minimum wage still hasn't gone up. So it goes to show how the government uses this as an excuse that the government, even if it's true that the government can't do anything under the sanctions, it also hasn't done anything when sanction relief has come about. But it's another important aspect. It's also used by governments to carry out their repression as well, because it is. I think it is fair to say that the sanctions are almost like a warlike situation. Of course, they're not the same. I don't want to sort of imply that bombs being dropped on a country is the same as sanctions being imposed on your ability to trade. But it does create that can certainly create that political climate within the country. So then that gets used to carry out repression that quite often is actually often more harsher against the left than it is against the right. We, of course, in the West hear about the repression against the right-wing opposition because that's who the media wants us to think is the only legitimate opposition, the only legitimate political force in the country. But they don't tell you that, for example, that in the last presidential elections, in the 2024 presidential elections, whilst the right had their candidate, and there were a number of other candidates that we would situate politically to the right of the governing Socialist Party of Venezuela, no left candidate was able to run. No left ticket was able to participate. The first time since 1958, since the fall of the military dictatorship in Venezuela, there was no left ticket in those elections. And of course, sanctions are part of explaining that. So I think that's the second part of why the sanctions are important. And I think the third part in understanding what's going on in Venezuela and the impacts the sanctions have had is, and this is the way that I've argued it, is that the sanctions were explained on the basis, sometimes openly, sometimes not so. But I think it's pretty clear that the sanctions, the purpose of the sanctions were regime change. That's what the US government was hoping, that essentially by strangling the economy, people would get angry, people would turn on the government and overthrow the government, and then we would have a new government in Caracas. And people have kind of argued, well, the sanctions haven't succeeded because they didn't change the regime, because the Maduro government, or at least until January 3, was still in power. But my argument is that actually the sanctions did actually succeed in carrying out regime change. If we understand regime change is not just simply a question of changing the figures in government, but in changing the actual overall trajectory and politics of that government. And so the sanctions, combined with other factors, are definitely a key part of why we went from the policies that were implemented by Chavez and in the first few years of the Maduro government, which still remained, or at least had a certain continuity with the Chavez government policies, to the policies that we see enacted after about 2016, 2017, 2018, where they are very clearly just a kind of policies that if any other government had carried out in Latin America, we would be out on the streets announcing, starting with, for instance, seeking to deal with inflation by absolutely crushing government spending, driving, even Javier Milei in Argentina hasn't succeeded in slashing government spending as much as the Maduro government succeeded in the years of 2016, 2017, 2018. And this was their way of tackling the hyperinflation. It's just traditional traditional orthodox macroeconomic stabilization program, generally generally suggested by the IMF and the World Bank to be implemented in country after country after country. And sadly, actually, the Venezuelan government was able to get away with an even harsher one that most other governments are able to get away with because of the level of repression and the fact that there was very little resistance from the left, because it was kind of seen as, well, this was just necessary, this was required because of the sanctions. When in fact it was a deliberate policy choice, a deliberate policy choice within our constrained factors, no doubt about that, but still a choice. And that's why I say that there was regime change that did happen in Venezuela. The politics of the regime, the government in Caracas did shift. And if we understand that, we can understand what's happening post January 3 a lot better, I think, as well.
I want to switch the direction a bit. Vijay Prashad has argued that to avoid monastic purism, the left should treat Maduro as having held the socialist line. What is that claim doing politically? What is it trying to protect? And what does it ask people to bracket or downplay?
Yeah, well, look, the argument that, which it's an argument that's pretty widespread in the left. So it's not just something that one or two individuals have argued, but there is this sort of belief that somehow strangely being honest makes our task harder for us. And what do I mean by that? The reality is that even in the government's discourse within Venezuela, it no longer really pretends that it's somehow holding some kind of socialist line. And I'm not talking about post January 3. Even beforehand, the government discourse within Venezuela was much more focused on, the way out of the economic crisis is individualism, entrepreneurship, set up your business. This is the way that you're going to get ahead in society. The discourse, an anathema to the idea of a socialist discourse, a socialist government. The politics of the government, and here again, the actions of the opposition as well are part of explaining, but the actions of both the government and the opposition have led to a society where the vast bulk of population don't want anything to do with politics, don't want anything to do with socialism. So it's like a scorched earth policy that's been carried out in terms of sort of trying to build some kind of socialist project in Venezuela. Fine, you want to blame the government, you want to blame the opposition, you want to blame
A
the
lot
sanctions.
of a lot of this line gets routed through a wider story of polarity. In the Venezuelan case, what does multipolarity actually change on the ground, and where does it become a way of confusing geopolitical realignment with emancipation or sovereignty?
Yeah, so once we then move beyond the fact that there is very little basis to argue about the government being a socialist government, then the default after that is, well, at least it's an anti-imperialist government, which in general often only means anti-US imperialism. We could put aside here the question of do other imperialisms exist, Russia, China, are they imperialists or not? That's obviously a big question, but I think it's, whilst an important issue, it doesn't really matter what your exact position is on that in order to have a better understanding of the Venezuelan government, the Venezuelan situation today. But the general tenor becomes, therefore, you have to support the Venezuelan government and its actions because it is in confrontation with US imperialism, and US imperialism is the biggest problem we face in the world today. Now, here then becomes a fundamental question of the type of politics that you advocate. If your belief is that the way we are going to defeat US imperialism is simply by aligning ourselves with any and every government across the world that in some way has some level of conflict with US imperialism, and that's somehow that broad front is going to take us anywhere closer to our socialist project, then that kind of politics makes sense. And therefore you can have relationships and support not just Venezuelan government, but the previous Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad. You can stand with the regime in Tehran, in Iran, against the protesters that are out of the streets. But it's never been the position of the left and communist movement. If you go back and read what Lenin and the Communist International had to say around the times when they first start to have these discussions about struggles for national liberation and colonial freedom, sure, they said that it was necessary in certain cases where bourgeois liberation forces were fighting for these kind of fighting against colonial powers to lend some level of support to those struggles. But it always made clear that a decisive, dependent factor on that was the ability for working class forces to be able to independently organize themselves and independently express their own political views. Because it was only in that way that actual defeat of colonialism and imperialism could occur. It understood that fundamentally it was working class forces that were required to do that. So therefore, you face the contradiction in Venezuela. Do you support a government because it's in confrontation with US imperialism, even though that very same government is implementing policies that have destroyed any ability for working class forces to be able to organize themselves in Venezuela? Or do you be honest and say, well, whilst we will continue to campaign against US imperialism, we'll continue to demand an end to the sanctions, as much as I may have my criticisms of Nicolas Maduro and Celia Flores, will continue to campaign for their liberation, because the US government and no government around the world has the right to just go in and kidnap the leader of another country and supposedly, put him on trial in what's occurring now. So we could do that, but we can also be honest and say, but also the Venezuelan government in of itself is not our friend. It's the one that is restricting the ability for those who ultimately can defeat imperialism from being able to organize. And so I think that's why it's the correct approach to have. It's a correct approach because it's based on facts. It's based on the reality of what's happening in Venezuela, not the discourse of the government, but the actual policies that it implements. It's the best policy to have because it's based on truth. And it's always harder to run a campaign on myths and lies and claims, because ultimately you get caught out. Ultimately, ordinary people will sort of find out about the truths. And it's also the only way we can actually campaign and link up with ordinary working people in Venezuela. To pretend that somehow Venezuelan people themselves don't have criticisms of the government, haven't been involved in campaigns to defend their democratic rights in there, and to not seek to want to link up with them, to me, seems to be the opposite of what a progressive left solidarity movement should want. If we're genuine about the idea that for example, if we're genuine about the idea that only the Venezuelan people should be able to decide their fate, doesn't that, if we're honest and truth, extend to their right to be able to verify who won their last elections, irrespective of who actually did? Because if we're saying the Venezuelan people have that right to decide, well, then they should have that right to decide. Except somehow that right only applies in certain times and in certain circumstances. And it seems to be that circumstances always seem to get decided by people outside of those countries. I think actually the left is actually incumbent on the left to be the most fervent defenders of these basic policies and principles that have always been part of the left, and once again should become part of the left, although unfortunately have been left on the sideline because people are more interested in playing geopolitical games of multipolarity and thinking that somehow if we just get enough of these different rogue states together, it's not, no one's ever explained how, but somehow inch our way closer to socialism.
Closing, if the sword has shifted hands, as Leibowitz says, what would it mean to put it back in the hands of the masses, not romantically, but as a question of organization, protection, and capacity under conditions of siege and tightening control?
So I'm pretty sure the question was, what will it take to put the sword back into the hands of the masses? That's some of the question. So as I said, the reality is that today the left in Venezuela finds itself in an extremely difficult situation. It's an extremely difficult situation because it's politically, in the broader scheme of things, it's essentially facing a kind of, as I've said to you before, not even a neo-colonial process, more resembling a recolonization of Venezuela. So that's, of course, a very dangerous situation that it has to confront. It's doing so in the context of that it's still the Maduro government that's in power, and it's doing so that in a situation where it comes out of a period of a lot of debate, demoralization, disorganization, fragmentation, reassessments of what was it that went wrong in the Venezuelan process. Which doesn't mean that the left doesn't exist. It's still there. And there are still important initiatives, even and it has to be said, even within sectors that continue to support the government. I don't think the left should simply be reduced to only those who oppose Maduro. There are those that, for one reason or another, think that it's the best place for the left to be in is somehow maintaining a line of critical and support, often more criticism than support, but maintaining that line towards the government. I think that the real challenge there is trying to now navigate how what is the key task facing in the left today, and to I think it seems to me that this question of the recolonization of Venezuela that's occurring, seemingly, at least for now, with very little to no opposition from the government, is the big challenge, is figuring out how to move from the current state of still shock from the attacks, from a current state of demobilization of the majority of the population. As I said, there have been important demonstrations demanding the freedom of Maduro and Flores, but they should also not be over exaggerated. They're far from being on the scale that we've seen, for instance, in the coup against Chavez. How to build the necessary social forces to be able to repel this, and that's going to, as I said, possibly even require alliances with people who before January 3 sections of these left were in full confrontation with. But that's really the big challenge we face, and it is a little bit of an uphill battle. As I was saying to you before about how Venezuela has come to serve as a bit of a threat of the bad example, it is remarkable just how much the disaster that has been the last 10 years in Venezuela has, rightly or wrongly, or a combination of both, really swung a lot of the population away from the idea of nationalization of the oil company, ideas of socialism and left politics. And so that's going to be a challenge for the left, like how to deal with this when there is probably a large section of the population that sees as a lesser evil, or perhaps as the positive, privatization of the oil industry, and it's handing over to, so-called expert multinational companies to turn the situation around, when they look at their life experience of the last 10 years and just simply, as I said, right or wrongly, blame it all on just the fact that, the Maduro government was running the state oil company corruptly, and therefore we got to where we are. So I think that's where it is. It's almost a little bit, it's not starting from scratch, that's for sure, because there is important base to build off. There's important history as well there. As I said, even though Venezuela perhaps in the 90s might not have been viewed as the most, the country with the most important left, or anything like that, it has a history of struggle. It has a history of struggle with the 89 Caracazo. It has a history of struggle with the 2002 defeat of the military coup. It has a history of recent struggle with the defeat of the bosses lockout in 2002, 2003. So it's been able to really, for the left, on the one hand, to figure out how to navigate through this situation, how to reconnect with that broad section of society, which I mentioned to you before, has largely withdrawn from politics, that rejects the political class, wants nothing to do with politics, but still remembers fondly the Chavez period, still remembers that they can have an impact on history, that they can go onto the streets and change something. That's what it's going to take. How to do that is obviously, a very difficult question, but I think the support that we can give from outside, and reminding the left in Venezuela that we haven't forgot about them, that we still stand in solidarity with their struggles, will be really important moving forward.
Thank you for appearing on the Organic Filaments Network. This was a very engaging conversation on what's taking place in Venezuela and the stakes that are at play.
No. Once again, thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. It's really helped me as well to think about some of these issues, because of course these are unfolding events, and who knows what tomorrow will bring us as well.
Was our conversation with Federico Fuentes. If you found it valuable, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to support the project, you can visit buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Thank you for listening.